This is a story from my own life, something I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times. It's not something I'm proud of, exactly, but it's something that happened and it changed everything. The heavy, antique silverware felt cold and judgmental in my hands, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth of my Aunt Carol's formal dining room in Wellesley, Massachusetts. It was Thanksgiving, and the air, thick with the scent of roasted turkey and sage, was crackling with the tension that only family can generate. My Uncle Marcus sat at the head of the table, a king in his own personal fiefdom, his gold Rolex glinting under the crystal chandelier as he carved the bird with surgical precision. He paused, the knife hovering over the turkey's breast, and his gaze, magnified by his expensive glasses, settled on me. "So, Chloe," he began, his voice a theatrical boom that silenced the few pockets of side conversation. "Your mother tells me you're still messing around with those old, dusty photographs. Still playing artist in that little closet you call an apartment in Somerville." A few of my cousins snickered. My face burned hot. I saw my mother give a slight, pleading shake of her head, a silent request for him to stop, but Marcus never stopped. He was a wrecking ball of a man, a real estate developer who had paved over half of Boston's history and built glass towers in its place, and he only knew one way to move: forward and over anyone in his path. I tried to keep my voice even, a small act of defiance. "It's called archival restoration, Uncle Marcus. It's a bit more than just messing around." He let out a short, barking laugh, a sound that grated on my soul. "Archival restoration," he repeated, mocking the words. He pointed the carving knife at his own son, Mark, a junior partner at a Boston law firm. "Mark just closed on a Beacon Hill brownstone. Your cousin Jenna," he gestured to my aunt's daughter, "is finishing her residency at Mass General. They're building lives, Chloe. Real lives. And you." He finally sliced into the turkey, the sound wet and final. "You are wasting yours." The words hung in the air, more brutal than any physical blow. The silence from the rest of the family was my true humiliation. Their quiet assent, their refusal to meet my eyes. He wasn't just my uncle. He was the family's center of gravity, the sun everyone orbited, and he had just declared me a dead planet. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I drove back to my tiny apartment in Somerville that night in a haze of shame and a cold, simmering rage. The leftover turkey my mom had forced on me sat on the passenger seat, its smell now making me sick. My apartment, which had always felt like my sanctuary, suddenly seemed small and pathetic, just as he'd described it. It was a single room in a triple-decker, crammed with my equipment. High-resolution scanners, archival printers, trays of chemical baths, and boxes upon boxes of forgotten lives captured on glass plates and brittle paper. To Marcus, this was a closet full of dust. To me, it was a time machine. I had always been the family's black sheep. The quiet, artsy one in a clan of lawyers, doctors, and ruthless businessmen. I'd graduated from MassArt with a degree in photography and historical preservation. A choice Marcus had loudly declared the most expensive way to learn how to be poor. While my cousins were climbing corporate ladders, I was carefully, painstakingly, bringing ghosts back to life. I'd find collections at flea markets, estate sales, and dusty antique shops. Forgotten boxes of negatives that held the faces of people whose names were lost to time. I'd spend weeks cleaning a single glass plate, scanning it at an impossibly high resolution, and then digitally restoring the image, removing the cracks, the dust, the water damage, until the person behind the lens stared back at me, clear and present. It was quiet, meticulous work. It paid the bills, just barely, through small commissions from historical societies and families wanting to preserve their lineage. But it wasn't a career. Not in the way my family understood it. It didn't come with a corner office or a six-figure salary. That Thanksgiving was a turning point. The humiliation had been so public, so absolute, that it burned away the part of me that still craved my family's approval. It was replaced by something harder, something colder. It wasn't enough to just prove him wrong anymore. I wanted to see him fall. I wanted to be the one to push him. The thought was ugly, and it scared me, but it also felt like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. I started working with a fury I hadn't felt before. I took on every small job I could find, working 16-hour days, my world shrinking to the pixels on my screen and the smell of fixer solution. I was saving money building a buffer, though I wasn't sure for what. The target was still a blur, a shapeless desire for vengeance. The opportunity arrived 3 months later, in a cardboard box at a snowy estate auction in Concord. The auction was for the remnants of the Pembroke estate, a family whose wealth had vanished in the 1930s. The box was labeled miscellaneous, glass plates/damaged. Nobody else even bid on it. I got it for $20. When I got it back to my studio and pried open the lid, I felt a jolt of electricity. It wasn't just a random assortment. It was a cohesive collection, hundreds of 8 by 10 glass plate negatives. Judging by the clothing and the scenery, they were from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The photographer had been extraordinarily talented, capturing the unvarnished life of Boston's working-class neighborhoods. The North End, Dorchester, Roxbury. These weren't the staid portraits of Beacon Hill Brahmins. They were dockworkers on Commercial Street, children playing in the alleyways of Copp's Hill, women hanging laundry on lines strung between tenement buildings. It was a lost world, a historical treasure trove. I spent the next month just cleaning and cataloging them. The photographer, I discovered from a barely legible signature on one of the wooden crates, was a man named Silas Emerson. He was a ghost. No record of him existed in any official photography archives. He had documented 30 years of a city in flux, and then vanished. This was more than a project. It could be a legacy. My legacy. I started the restoration process on the most promising plate, a stunningly clear image of a group of men standing outside a brick building, its sign barely legible. The Mariners' Benevolent Exchange. I began researching the building, trying to pinpoint the exact location for the historical record. I scoured old city maps and directories at the Boston Public Library, cross-referencing street names that had long since changed. Finally, I found it. The building had stood on what was now a desolate, forgotten corner of the waterfront, an area that had been mostly warehouses for the last 50 years. I pulled up the current property records for the address out of sheer curiosity. The lot had been sold just 2 months prior. The buyer was a shell corporation I'd never heard of, Atlantic Dominion Partners, LLC. It was the name that snagged my attention. My uncle had a habit of naming his LLCs with grand, vaguely powerful-sounding words. It was probably nothing, a coincidence, but the cold feeling in my gut told me to keep digging. I spent the next 48 hours falling down a rabbit hole of digital paperwork, navigating the labyrinthine websites of the Massachusetts Secretary of State and the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. I traced the registered agent for Atlantic Dominion Partners. It led me to a law firm, the same firm where my cousin Mark worked. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dug deeper, pulling the articles of organization for a dozen of my uncle's other known companies. The same boilerplate language, the same legal signatories, the same patterns. It was him. My uncle Marcus had bought the land where that historic building once stood. But why? It was a derelict part of town, with no zoning for the kind of luxury high-rises he specialized in. As I continued restoring more of Silas Emerson's photographs, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. I'd identify a tenement in the North End, a small factory in South Boston, a community hall in Dorchester, and I'd look up the property records. Again and again, I found the same thing. Over the past year, shell companies, all linked back to my uncle's network, had been quietly buying up these forgotten, often dilapidated historical properties. He was collecting them like game pieces. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when I stumbled upon a city planning proposal, buried deep on a municipal website. It was a massive redevelopment plan for the waterfront and surrounding districts, sponsored by a consortium of developers. The plan called for sweeping zoning changes, eminent domain seizures, and the creation of a new luxury commercial and residential zone. It was Marcus's magnum opus, a plan to remake a huge swath of the city in his own image. And the properties he had been surreptitiously acquiring were all strategically located at the heart of this proposed district. He was buying them for pennies on the dollar before the plan was announced, knowing their value would skyrocket into the tens of millions once it was approved. But there was a catch. Many of these buildings, while rundown, were protected by historical designations that would prevent their demolition. For his plan to work, those protections would have to vanish. As I stared at the redevelopment map on my screen, a restored photo of a little girl sitting on the steps of one of those very buildings glowing beside it, the true nature of my uncle's business became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just a developer. He was a predator, hunting the city's history, and my box of $20 glass plates was the only surviving record of the world he was preparing to slaughter. I leaned back in my chair, the dim light of my studio feeling like an interrogation room. The rage from Thanksgiving was no longer a hot, blinding fire. it had cooled into something focused, sharp, and patient. I didn't just have a reason to want revenge anymore. I had a weapon. My life bifurcated. By day, I was the devoted archivist, painstakingly restoring Silas Emerson's lost masterpieces. Each photo was a revelation. A woman's tired face, framed by the window of a tenement on Prince Street. The proud, defiant stare of a longshoreman, his hook resting on his shoulder. A blur of children playing stickball in an alley that no longer existed. I was giving them back their immortality, and with each restored face, my resolve hardened. They were my silent clients, my ghostly constituents, and I was their only advocate. By night, I became a different kind of archivist. I descended into the digital catacombs of municipal bureaucracy. I learned to read zoning variances, environmental impact reports, and minutes from obscure city council subcommittee meetings. I taught myself how to trace the convoluted webs of LLCs and trusts that real estate developers use to hide their identities, peeling back layers of corporate anonymity until I found my uncle's name, or the names of his closest associates, at the center. It was a slow, grueling process. The information was all public, but it was designed to be opaque, to discourage the very kind of scrutiny I was applying. I used the money I'd saved to hire a freelance researcher, a retired investigative journalist named Frank, who knew the city's political machinery inside and out. I told him I was working on a historical project about development patterns. I couldn't risk revealing the personal angle. Frank was a bloodhound. For a modest fee, he showed me the back doors, the loopholes, the places where the real business of the city was done. He taught me how to file Freedom of Information Act requests that couldn't be easily ignored. He explained how a lost historical designation survey or a reassessed building inspection report could pave the way for a demolition permit. Together, we started to map out my uncle's shadow operation. We found a clear pattern. A historical property would be acquired by one of his shell companies. Shortly after, an independent engineering report would surface, declaring the building structurally unsound and a public hazard. Then, a key document from the Boston Landmarks Commission's archives. A survey from the 1970s, for instance, that recommended the building for landmark status, would be reported as missing or misfiled. With the building deemed both dangerous and historically insignificant, the path was cleared for the wrecking ball. It was a slick, ruthlessly efficient system for erasing history. One night, I was working on a photo of a beautiful, small brick firehouse in Fort Point, dated 1895. The Emerson plate was so clear I could see the individual bricks and the proud, handlebar-mustached firemen standing by their horse-drawn engine. I looked up the address. My uncle had bought it 6 months ago. 2 weeks after the sale, the building's original historical survey, which I knew existed because I had found a reference to it in a 1982 newspaper article, was officially declared lost from the municipal archive. I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just exploiting loopholes. This was active, criminal destruction of public records. To confirm my suspicion, I needed to see his power in person again, to remind myself of what I was up against. I found out from my mother that he was being honored at a big real estate gala at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. I bought a ticket I couldn't afford and went alone. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns laughed and networked, their voices echoing off the gilded ceiling. And there, at the center of it all, was Marcus, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by city councilors, bank presidents, and other developers. He was magnetic, charming, his booming laugh filling the space around him. He looked utterly untouchable, a titan of industry being celebrated for his vision and civic leadership. He was accepting an award for urban renewal. The irony was so profound it felt like a physical weight. As he walked to the podium to give his speech, he passed right by me. He glanced at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly followed by a dismissive smirk. It was the same look from Thanksgiving, a look that said, "What are you doing here in the world of important people?" He took the stage and launched into a soaring speech about progress, about building a new Boston for a new century, about the need to clear away the decay of the past to make way for the vibrancy of the future. The crowd applauded thunderously. They saw a visionary. I saw a grave robber. Standing in the back of that opulent ballroom, I felt a strange sense of calm descend over me. The fear, the self-doubt, the feeling of being a small, insignificant girl fighting a giant, it all evaporated. I saw him not as my powerful, intimidating uncle, but as a hollow man, a parasite feeding on the soul of a city. He thought the past was just dirt and rubble to be cleared away. But I was holding it in my hands. I was restoring it, sharpening it, and turning it into a mirror. A mirror I was going to force him to look into. That night, after the gala, I went back to my apartment and laid out my plan. It wasn't enough to expose him. That would be messy, he said, she said, battle that he, with his army of lawyers, would likely win. I had to create a situation so airtight, so publicly undeniable, that he would have no escape. The Emerson collection was my Trojan horse. I started a website, a simple, elegant online gallery showcasing the first 20 restored photographs. I wrote brief histories for each image, telling the stories of the people and the places Silas Emerson had captured. I shared it on social media, with local history groups, and with architectural preservation societies. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails poured in from historians, professors, and ordinary Bostonians who were captivated by this lost vision of their city. A writer from the Boston Globe's Sunday magazine contacted me for an interview. The article, titled "The Ghost Keeper of Somerville," was a small, human interest piece, but it gave the project a new level of legitimacy. A few weeks later, I got the email that changed everything. It was from Dr. Alastair Finch, the chief curator of the Boston Historical Society. He had seen the article and the website. He called the Emerson collection a discovery of unparalleled significance. He wanted to meet, urgently. I walked into the stately, intimidating headquarters of the Historical Society on a Tuesday morning, my portfolio case clutched in my sweaty hands. Dr. Finch was a tall, thin man with an infectious, scholarly passion. For 2 hours, he and his team looked through my prints, their reactions a mixture of awe and reverence. They understood what I had found. They saw the same cultural treasure that I did. Finally, Dr. Finch leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice serious, "this collection cannot be allowed to remain in a private portfolio. It belongs to the city. It belongs to the world. The Boston Historical Society is prepared to make you a substantial offer to acquire the full digital and exhibition rights for the entire Silas Emerson collection." He slid a piece of paper across the mahogany table. It was a preliminary offer sheet. My eyes scanned the numbers and my breath caught in my throat. It was a life-changing amount of money. But it wasn't the number that made my heart pound. It was the line at the bottom of the proposal. "The acquisition will be accompanied by a major public exhibition, Silas Emerson's Boston, and a citywide historical preservation initiative based on the locations documented in the photographs." This was it. This was the moment. I took a deep breath. "Dr. Finch," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I'm honored. But there's something you need to know about the locations in these photographs. I have reason to believe that many of them are under imminent threat from a single development consortium." I spent the next hour laying it all out. I didn't mention my uncle's name. I kept it professional, presenting myself as a historical researcher who had stumbled upon a disturbing pattern. I showed them the property records, the conveniently missing documents, the timeline of acquisitions. I connected the dots. The curators and board members around the table listened, their expressions shifting from scholarly interest to grim concern. They weren't just historians, they were the city's official guardians. I had brought the enemy directly to their gates. Dr. Finch looked at the evidence, then back at me. A new, harder light was in his eyes. "This is deeply disturbing," he said slowly. "This isn't just development. It's a targeted erasure of our city's heritage." He tapped the offer sheet. "Our offer stands. In fact, we will amend it. We will retain a legal team to investigate these claims and fight for the protection of every single site you've identified. We will fund your research to support that effort. You won't just be an artist for this exhibition, Ms. Vance. You'll be our lead historical consultant and star witness." I looked at him, the weight of his words settling over me. My personal vendetta had just acquired the full backing of one of the most powerful cultural institutions in the city. I was no longer a lone girl in a small apartment. I was the leader of an army. I reached across the table and shook his hand. "You have a deal," I said. "Where do we begin?" The car ride home was surreal. I pulled over by the Charles River, the Boston skyline glittering in the afternoon sun. My uncle's towers were a part of that skyline, sharp glass needles stabbing at the sky. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea that a quiet, unassuming historian in a 20-year-old car had just signed his death warrant. I looked at the calendar on my phone. Thanksgiving was 8 months away. The perfect deadline. The following 8 months were a blur of meticulous, parallel work. My apartment officially transformed into a war room. One half was the sunlit artist's studio, where I carefully restored the remaining glass plates of the Emerson collection, each image a beautiful piece of ammunition. The other half was the darkened command center, where I worked with the Historical Society's legal team, a pair of sharp, relentless lawyers named David and Sarah. They were astounded by the volume and quality of the evidence I had already gathered. With the Society's resources behind us, we went deeper. We subpoenaed records the city had been slow to release. We hired forensic accountants to trace the money flows through the labyrinth of LLCs. We found the smoking gun in a series of emails acquired through a source Frank, the retired journalist, had cultivated inside the city planning department. The emails were between my uncle and a deputy commissioner, explicitly discussing the management of historical survey documents to streamline the approval process for his redevelopment plan. It was blatant, undeniable proof of collusion and conspiracy to defraud the city. All the while, I was working hand-in-glove with Dr. Finch and the curatorial team to plan the Silas Emerson's Boston exhibition. It was scheduled to open the first week of December. They had booked the main gallery, and the press machine was already kicking into gear. They were framing it as the cultural event of the season. My name, Chloe Vance, the discoverer and brilliant restorer of the collection, was featured prominently on all the promotional materials. My family, of course, was oblivious. My mother would call and ask with a worried tone if I'd spoken to Marcus, if I was going to make an effort for the holidays this year. The family is so fractured, she'd sigh. I would give her non-committal answers, my heart aching with the knowledge of the bomb I was about to detonate. I felt a pang of guilt for what this would do to her, and to my father, who had always quietly supported my passion but hated conflict. But the memory of that Thanksgiving table, of my uncle's smug face and the silent complicity of everyone else, was a potent antidote to my remorse. They had made their choice when they sat in silence. Now I was making mine. As autumn arrived, the final pieces of the plan clicked into place. The legal team had compiled a devastating dossier, ready to be submitted to the State Attorney General's office. The exhibition was fully curated, the prints framed, the gallery walls painted. The Historical Society had arranged for a major press conference on the Monday after Thanksgiving to announce the exhibition and, more importantly, the launch of their preservation initiative, which would be accompanied by their legal findings. The first payment from the Historical Society arrived in my bank account in early November. It was a wire transfer for a staggering amount, the first installment of my acquisition and consulting fee. I went to the bank and requested a cashier's check. Not for the full amount, but for a very specific number, $300,000. Holding it felt surreal. It was just a piece of paper, but it was also validation, power, and the ultimate, irrefutable symbol of my success on my own terms. It was the receipt for my uncle's downfall. Thanksgiving was to be held at his house again. The invitation from my Aunt Carol had been a little strained, an olive branch I knew my mother had pressured her into extending. I accepted immediately, my voice sweet and placid on the phone. The week before the holiday was the longest of my life. I went over the plan again and again. I had prepared a small, portable projector and a USB drive. The drive contained a simple presentation. A slideshow of Silas Emerson's most evocative photographs, followed by scans of the incriminating property deeds, the forged engineering reports, and the damning emails, all neatly organized and highlighted. The final slide was a simple, stark image of the $300,000 check. I walked up the stone pathway to my uncle's house in Wellesley feeling preternaturally calm. The same oppressive warmth hit me as I stepped inside. The same scent of turkey and sage. The same faces, all a year older. Marcus was at the door, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked me up and down, a familiar, patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Chloe," he said, his voice laced with mock surprise. "Decided to join the land of the living, did you? Still playing with those little pictures?" I smiled back, a genuine, serene smile that seemed to confuse him. My purse, containing the check, the projector, and the USB drive, felt wonderfully heavy against my shoulder. "Something like that, Uncle Marcus," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I've been working on a new project. I think you'll find it particularly interesting. You'll have to see for yourself." Dinner was an exercise in supreme self-control. I sat quietly, eating my turkey and listening to the familiar rhythms of my family's conversation. Mark was boasting about a new case he was on. Jenna was complaining about hospital bureaucracy. And Marcus, at the head of the table, was holding court, pontificating about the spineless politicians on Beacon Hill and the brilliant future of Boston. A future he was personally building. He seemed even more arrogant than the year before, buoyed by the imminent approval of his grand redevelopment plan. He didn't know he was a dead man walking. I let him talk. I let them all talk. I watched the dynamics of power and deference play out, the way my aunts and uncles hung on his every word. I felt strangely disconnected from it all, like an anthropologist observing a tribe on the verge of extinction. Finally, as dessert was being served, my Aunt Carol's famous pumpkin pie, Marcus turned his attention back to me. It was almost a perfect reenactment of the previous year. "So, Chloe," he boomed, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Last chance. Did that little hobby of yours finally manage to pay a bill this year? Or is your father still subsidizing your artistic endeavors?" The table fell quiet. Everyone looked at me, expecting the same cowed, humiliated response as before. This was my cue. I placed my fork down gently. "It's funny you ask, Uncle Marcus," I said, my voice carrying in the sudden silence. I stood up. "Actually, my little hobby has been quite profitable. And it's led me to a story I think the whole family should hear." I walked over to the large flat-screen television, mounted on the dining room wall. Before anyone could react, I had pulled the small projector from my purse, connected it to my phone, and projected a crisp, clear image onto the screen. The first image was one of Silas Emerson's masterpieces, a beautifully restored photograph of the Mariners' Benevolent Exchange from 1898. A murmur of appreciation went through the room. "Wow, Chloe, did you do that?" my Aunt Carol asked, impressed. "I did," I said. "This is the work of a forgotten Boston photographer named Silas Emerson. I found his entire collection. He spent his life documenting the parts of the city that history has forgotten." I clicked to the next slide. A tenement in the North End. Then a firehouse in Fort Point. I showed them a dozen images, a parade of Boston's ghosts, their faces clear and hauntingly alive. The family was captivated. Then the tone of the presentation shifted. The next slide showed the deed of sale for the Mariners' Exchange property. The buyer, Atlantic Dominion Partners, LLC. As I was researching these historical locations, I explained, my voice cold and clinical, I discovered a strange coincidence. Many of them, despite being historically significant, were being bought up by a network of anonymous shell companies. I clicked again. Another deed. Another shell company. I showed them the web I had untangled, the corporate veils, all leading back to one place. I could feel the mood in the room curdling from curiosity to confusion and unease. Marcus had stopped eating his pie. His face was rigid, his eyes fixed on the screen. "What is the meaning of this, Chloe?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I ignored him. I also found that in almost every case, crucial historical documents related to these properties had a habit of disappearing from the city archives right before they were sold. And then, conveniently, an engineering report would appear, declaring the buildings structurally unsound. The next slide showed a copy of the lost historical survey for the Fort Point firehouse, which I had unearthed from a private archive, next to the fraudulent engineering report my uncle had commissioned. I had highlighted the forged signatures and falsified data in red. "What you're looking at," I said, turning to face the room, "is a systematic criminal conspiracy to defraud the city. A plan to secretly acquire historically protected properties, illegally strip them of their protections, and then demolish them for a massive redevelopment project." I finally turned my gaze directly to my uncle. "A project, Uncle Marcus, that you are spearheading." The silence was absolute. My cousin Mark's face was ashen. He knew. He worked at the law firm that had filed the paperwork. My Aunt Carol looked from the screen to her husband, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Marcus shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is slander. You're a bitter, failed little girl trying to tear down a successful man because you have nothing of your own," he roared, his face turning a blotchy, apoplectic red. "You have no proof. It's all just pathetic conjecture." "Oh, I have proof," I said calmly. The next slide filled the screen. It was the email, the one between Marcus and the deputy commissioner. The subject line read, "Managing HLC Assets." The body of the email was clear as day, discussing the need to clear the path by archiving certain inconvenient documents. "This, and a great deal more, is already in the hands of the Boston Historical Society's legal counsel," I said. "They'll be submitting it to the Attorney General's office on Monday morning, along with a request for a full criminal investigation." Marcus stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing silently. The bluster, the arrogance, the power, it all drained from his face, leaving behind the slack, terrified visage of a man who had just been publicly executed. He looked old. He looked small. And then, for my final act, I reached into my purse and pulled out the cashier's check. I didn't flourish it. I simply walked to the head of the table and laid it down next to his half-eaten slice of pie. "You asked if my hobby paid a bill," I said, my voice just above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "This is the first payment on a $300,000 contract from the Boston Historical Society. They hired me to acquire and restore the Emerson collection, to preserve the very history you were trying to erase. They call it a cultural treasure. The money I'm using to fund the investigation that's going to destroy you? It came from the ghosts you tried to bury." He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and in his eyes I didn't see anger. I saw fear. Pure, bottomless fear. The king had been dethroned in his own castle, at his own feast, by the one person in his kingdom he had never, ever seen as a threat. The aftermath was a silent explosion. For a long moment nobody moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of the projector, displaying the image of the check on the screen like a final, damning piece of evidence at a trial. My Aunt Carol let out a small, choked sob. My father, who had been sitting stone-faced through the entire presentation, slowly pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked over to stand behind me. He didn't say a word, just placed a hand on my shoulder. It was all the affirmation I needed. I calmly packed up my small projector and my phone, zipped my purse shut, and turned to leave. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. As I walked through the grand foyer, I heard the first shouts erupting behind me, the sound of a family and an empire beginning to implode. The drive back to Somerville was quiet and dreamlike. The rage that had fueled me for a year was gone, leaving behind a vast, peaceful emptiness. It wasn't the giddy thrill of victory I had expected. It was the profound, solemn relief of a long war finally being over. The news broke on the Monday, just as the Historical Society's lawyers had planned. It was a lead story. Prominent Boston developer Marcus Vance accused of fraud, conspiracy in sweeping redevelopment scheme. The article mentioned an unnamed historical consultant, who had uncovered the plot while restoring a trove of historically significant photographs. My anonymity wouldn't last, but for now it gave me a shield. The Attorney General's office launched an official investigation that very week. My uncle's assets were frozen. His grand redevelopment plan was declared dead on arrival. The city councilors and commissioners who had been in his pocket scattered like rats from a sinking ship, all claiming they had been duped. The family fractured, just as my mother had feared, but not in the way she had imagined. Some of my cousins and aunts called me furious, accusing me of destroying the family for petty revenge. Others, including my cousin Mark, who quietly resigned from his law firm, called to thank me for stopping a man they had all feared but had been too weak to stand up to. I didn't engage with either side. I simply disconnected. My father and mother stood by me, caught between their loyalty to me and the wreckage of their extended family. It was hard on them, but my father, in a rare moment of emotional clarity, told me, "You did what was right, Chloe. Pride is a poison, and your uncle has been drinking it for 30 years. The Silas Emerson's Boston exhibition opened in December to rave reviews. The opening night gala was a world away from my uncle's self-congratulatory real estate party. This was a gathering of artists, historians, students, and ordinary Bostonians who came to see the faces of their ancestors, the streets their grandparents had walked. They stood in front of the large, luminous prints, whispering in awe. They weren't just looking at old pictures. They were connecting with their own history. I stood in a quiet corner of the gallery watching them. Dr. Finch found me and handed me a glass of champagne. "Look at this, Chloe," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You didn't just save a collection of photographs. You saved a piece of the city's soul." I saw my own reflection in the glass covering a photo of a young immigrant girl staring defiantly into Silas Emerson's lens over a century ago. We were from different worlds, different centuries, but I felt a kinship with her, a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for your place in a world that was designed to overlook you. The investigation into my uncle would drag on for years, a slow, methodical dismantling of his life's work. But his power was already gone, his name already a synonym for greed and corruption. He had been erased from the city's future as thoroughly as he had tried to erase its past. My uncle built an empire of glass and steel on foundations of lies, but I discovered that history, like a photograph, always holds the truth in negative. The end.